I had just moved into my new apartment about 2 months ago. It wasn't anything fancy, a one-bedroom in an older building, but it was my own space, and that meant everything to me. The building had a certain vintage charm, though the paint was peeling in some places and the stairs creaked more than I liked. But hey, for what I was paying, I didn't mind. It was quiet enough, and I liked the vibe of the neighborhood. At first, I was busy unpacking and settling in, so I didn't notice much around me. But one evening, after I had finally gotten most of my stuff in order, I decided to relax in the living room with a cup of tea. I remember glancing out the window, just people watching, when I first saw him. Across the street, in the building directly opposite mine, there was a man standing at his window. I wouldn't have thought much of it, but he was staring right at me, like directly at me. I quickly looked away, feeling a little awkward. I figured it was just one of those things. Maybe he was zoning out or looking at something behind me. But over the next few days, I started noticing him more and more. Every time I looked out my window, he was there, just standing, watching. At first, I told myself it was just a coincidence. People look out their windows, right? Maybe he had a good view or something. But it started to get weirder. He was always there. Day or night, morning or evening, he'd be standing by that window, staring straight at my apartment. And I mean always. I even started testing it. I'd peek out of my curtains at random times, trying to catch him off guard, but every time, there he was. I started getting paranoid. Was he watching me specifically? Or was he just someone with a habit of standing by the window? I started closing my blinds more often, trying to block him out, but even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that his eyes were on me. It got to the point where I felt like I was being watched inside my own apartment, even when the blinds were drawn. I'd hear small noises like the creaking of the old pipes or the groaning of the wood floors, and every time my mind would jump to him. Then came the night I tried to confront him. I had had enough of feeling like a prisoner in my own home. I decided I'd knock on his door and ask him what his deal was. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe he didn't even realize how creepy he was being. But I had to know. I waited until evening, when I knew he'd be at the window. Sure enough, there he was. I could see his silhouette through the curtains, just standing there, like always. I gathered my courage, went across the street, and knocked on his door. No answer. I knocked again, louder this time. Still nothing. I was frustrated, but also starting to feel a bit spooked. I knew he was home. I had seen him at the window just minutes earlier. I tried the doorknob, and to my surprise, it was unlocked. My heart was racing, but I pushed the door open anyway. Inside, the apartment was pitch black, and it was dead quiet. The air felt stale, like no one had been living there for a long time. I stepped inside, calling out, but no one answered. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing up as I made my way toward the window where I had seen him. When I reached it, my blood ran cold. There was no one there. In fact, the apartment was completely empty. No furniture, no personal belongings, just dust and silence. It looked like no one had lived there for years. I backed out of the apartment quickly, my heart pounding in my ears. I hurried home and locked every door and window. I didn't sleep that night. The next day, I called the landlord and asked him about the guy in the apartment across from mine. He seemed confused. No one's lived in that unit for years, he told me. My blood ran cold. I asked him if he was sure, and he insisted that the place had been vacant for at least a decade. To this day, I don't know who or what I saw standing in that window. But I moved out a few weeks later. I couldn't stay there anymore. I still think about it sometimes, especially late at night. Was it all in my head? Or was there someone or something watching me from that window? Max was everything to me. I'd had him for 5 years, and honestly, he was more than just a dog. He was my best friend. We did everything together, from hiking in the woods to lazy Sunday mornings at the park. He was one of those dogs that everyone loved, always wagging his tail and full of energy. So when I moved into my new house, there was no question that Max would be coming with me. The neighborhood was quiet, and the house itself was perfect. It was an older house with a big backyard, perfect for Max to run around. Everything seemed great, except for one thing: Mr. Jenkins, my next-door neighbor. From the moment I moved in, he had a problem with Max. Jenkins was an older guy, probably in his 70s, and he had this sour look on his face every time he saw us. It didn't take long for the complaints to start. Jenkins would shout over the fence every time Max barked, telling me to keep that damn dog quiet, or threatening to call the police. At first, I tried to be understanding. Max could get a little excited, especially when someone came to the door, but I always made sure he wasn't out of control. But no matter what I did, Jenkins wasn't satisfied. He'd glare at me from his yard or mutter under his breath as he passed by. I tried to brush it off, but it was getting harder and harder to ignore. Then, one afternoon, I came home from work and Max was gone. My heart sank as I realized the backyard gate was wide open. I called his name, but there was no response. Panic set in as I searched the entire neighborhood, calling out for him. I posted flyers, called local shelters, and knocked on doors, but no one had seen him. It was like he had vanished. After a couple of days with no sign of Max, I started to suspect Jenkins. He had made it clear how much he hated Max, and now my dog was missing. It couldn't just be a coincidence. I kept an eye on Jenkins after that, and it didn't take long for things to get even stranger. I started noticing Jenkins in his backyard late at night, digging. At first, I thought he was just working on his garden, but the more I watched, the more I realized he was doing something else. He'd be out there at all hours, shoveling in the dark, his face lit only by the dim glow of his porch light. My stomach churned with suspicion. Was he burying something? I couldn't take it anymore. One night, around midnight, I decided to confront him. I waited until he had gone back inside, then slipped into his backyard. My heart was racing, and every instinct was telling me to turn back. But I had to know. I crept to the spot where I had seen him digging and started scraping at the dirt with my hands. After a few minutes of digging, my fingers hit something hard. It was a small box buried just beneath the surface. My hands were shaking as I pried it open. Inside was Max's collar. My heart stopped. I didn't even think. I just grabbed the collar and ran back to my house, locking every door behind me. The next day, I called the police, but without solid proof, there wasn't much they could do. I kept an eye on Jenkins after that, but he acted like nothing was wrong. The whole thing felt like some twisted nightmare. Then, about a week later, I heard scratching at my front door in the middle of the night. My heart raced as I opened it, and there he was, Max. He was trembling, his fur matted and dirty, but he was alive. I hugged him, tears streaming down my face, but when I looked closer, I saw that there was something attached to his collar. It was a note, scrawled in messy handwriting. I told you to keep him quiet. I moved out the next month. I couldn't live next to Jenkins anymore, knowing what he had done. To this day, I have no idea how Max got out, or what Jenkins did to him while he was gone. All I know is that I'll never forget the sight of that collar buried in the dirt, or the sound of Max's whimpers that night. When my husband Tom and I bought our first house, it felt like a dream come true. We'd been saving for years, and finally, we found the perfect place. It was a charming little bungalow on a quiet street with just enough space for us and room to grow. The house needed some work, sure, but we were ready for the challenge. Everything seemed perfect at first. We spent our weekends fixing up the house, painting walls, and making it our own. The neighborhood was friendly enough, and we quickly got to know most of our neighbors. But one neighbor in particular stood out. Mrs. Henderson, the elderly woman who lived next door. At first, she seemed sweet. She came over the day we moved in with a basket of cookies and welcomed us to the neighborhood. She was in her 70s, with silver hair and a warm smile. She told us all about the history of the neighborhood and offered tips on gardening, which was her hobby. It seemed innocent enough, but as the weeks went on, her behavior started to make me uncomfortable. Mrs. Henderson would show up at our house at odd times, unannounced. Sometimes I'd look out the window, and there she'd be, standing in her yard, just staring. Other times, she'd knock on the door with strange questions, like if we'd noticed anything unusual in our basement. That one really threw me. Why would she care about our basement? We hadn't even finished unpacking down there. Tom thought I was overreacting. He said she was just lonely, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. One night, after Mrs. Henderson had asked about the basement for the third time, I decided to take a closer look. The basement was mostly unfinished, with old brick walls and a dirt floor in some areas. As I was poking around, I noticed something strange about one of the walls. The bricks didn't quite line up with the rest of the structure, and there was a gap where the mortar had crumbled away. My heart raced as I tugged at one of the loose bricks, and it came free with a soft thud. Behind the wall was a small hidden space, barely big enough for a person to stand in. Inside, I found a stack of old newspapers, yellowed with age. My hands shook as I pulled them out and started reading. The headlines were about Mrs. Henderson's family, her husband and 2 children. They had all gone missing decades ago under mysterious circumstances. I couldn't believe what I was reading. I had never heard anything about Mrs. Henderson's family. No one in the neighborhood had mentioned it. The articles described a long search, but no bodies were ever found. Eventually, the case went cold, and the family was presumed dead. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing strange noises coming from Mrs. Henderson's house, faint voices and what sounded like footsteps. I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination, but the next morning, when I went to check the basement again, the loose brick had been replaced, and Mrs. Henderson was waiting for me at the door, holding one of her cookie baskets. I never went back into that basement. We moved out a few months later, but I still think about Mrs. Henderson. I never told Tom what I found behind that wall, and he still thinks she was just a sweet old lady. But I know better.